Well, I didn't realize there was going to be so much on this one little chapter that seems to be a diversion and a distraction. The 38th chapter. Now Tamar, and one of the books that I've been finding a few things in was this book, The Harlot by the Side of the Road. That was the title of this book. And the subtitle was The Forbidden Tales of the Bible by Jonathan Kirsch. And he, 38. But to go ahead and refresh our memory and to get kind of back into it, let me read the story again. It happened at that time that Judah went down from his brothers and settled near a certain Adulamite, whose name was Hirah. And there Judah saw the daughter of a certain Canaanite, whose name was Shua. And he married her and went into her. And she conceived and bore a son, and he named him Again she conceived and bore a son, whom she named Onan. And then one of the commentaries says, in the culture at that time, usually the mother named the child, so that's a little diversion for Judah naming the first one and then she names the second and the third. And again she bore a son, and she named him Shelah. And she was in Shebez when she bore him, and Judah took a wife for his firstborn. In one sentence we go from birth to marrying him off. So we have a big jump in time there. And Judah married off the firstborn to a lady named Tamar, but we presume she's a Canaanite as well, because that's where they are, and none of his kin were close. But Judah, firstborn, was wicked in the sight of the Lord, and the Lord put him to death. And then Judah said to Onan, "Go into your brother's wife and perform the duty of a brother-in-law to her, and raise up offspring for your brother." But since Onan knew that the offspring would not be his, he spilled his semen on the ground whenever he went in with his brother's wife, so that he would not give offspring to his brother. What he did was displeasing in the sight of the Lord, and he put him to death also. And then Judah said to his daughter-in-law, Tamar, "Remain a widow in your father's house until my son Shelah grows up." For Judah feared that he too, Shelah, would die, like his brother. So Tamar went to live in her father's house. In the course of time, the wife of Judah, who has remained nameless, Shua's daughter, died. And when Judah's time of mourning was over, now remember we had this whole thing about Jacob being unconsoled and grieving until he would go to his death. Here, Judah goes along with the culture, and he mourns for the prescribed time, and then he's done. And so he went up to Timnah to the sheep shearers, he and his friend Hirah the Adulamite. And when Tamar was told, "Your father-in-law is going up to Timnah to shear his sheep," she put off her widow's garments and put on a veil and wrapped herself up in a shawl, some translations say, and she sat down at the entrance to Enim, which is on the road to Timnah. And she saw that Shelah was grown up, yet she had not been given to him in marriage. And when Judah saw her, he thought her to be a prostitute, for she had covered her face. Now the translation there could be confusing. He thought she was a prostitute because she covered her face. Now that gives the impression that by covering her face, that makes her look like a prostitute, instead of what it may have been, in that since her face was covered, he didn't recognize who it was, which then allowed him to presume her to be a prostitute. But anyway, when he saw her, he thought her to be a prostitute, for she had covered her face. He went over to her at the roadside and said, "Come, let me come in to you." For he did not know that she was his daughter-in-law. And she said, "What will you give me, that you may come in to me?" And he answered, "I will send you a kid from the flock." And she said, "Only if you give me a pledge until you send it." And he said, "What pledge shall I give you?" And she replied, "Your signet, and your cord, and the staff that is in your hand." So he gave them to her, and went into her, and she conceived by him. And then she got up and went away, and taking off her veil, she put on the garments of her widowhood. And when Judah sent the kid by his friend, the Adulamite, this Adulamite gets, if we were having the Academy Awards, he might get a supporting actor role here, because he's doing a lot in this story. Anyway, to recover the pledge from the woman, he could not find her, and he asked the townspeople, "Where is the temple prostitute who was in him at the wayside?" Now all of a sudden, she's just not a common prostitute, but she's a temple prostitute, which changes the whole perspective of the story. But they said, "No prostitute has been there." No kind of a prostitute had been there. Nobody had recognized her sitting there looking like a prostitute. They may have seen her there, but they didn't recognize her as being a prostitute. So they said, "No prostitute has been here." So he returned to Judah and said, "I have not found her." Moreover, the townspeople said, "No prostitute has been here." And Judah replied, "Well, let her keep the things as her own. Otherwise, we will be laughed at, or become a laughing stock. You see, I sent this kid, and you could not find her." So he says, "My conscience is clear." Well, about 3 months later, Judah was told, "Your daughter-in-law, Tamar, has played the whore. Moreover, she is pregnant as a result of whoredom." And Judah said, "Bring her out and let her be burned." And as she was being brought out, meaning they were going to execute her immediately, she sent word to her father-in-law, "It was the owner of these who made me pregnant." And she said, "Take note, please, whose these are, the signet and the cord and the staff." And then Judah acknowledged them and said, "She is more in the right than I, since I did not give her to my son Shelah, and he did not lie with her again." This is kind of the same wording, they tell us, when she says, "Look at these things," the same way Joseph's brothers had said to Jacob, "Look at this bloody robe, and then you make the judgment." And so it's kind of that same legal kind of dialogue and presentation of evidence, and then allowing him to make the judgment. When her time came for her to deliver, there were twins in her womb, and while she was in labor, one put out a hand, and the midwife took and bound on his hand a crimson thread, saying, "This one came out first." But just then he drew back his hand, and out came his brother. And she said, "What a breach you have made for yourself." Therefore he was named Perez. Now here again we have the crimson cord signified firstborn, but not actually firstborn, because he withdrew his hand, and then out comes Perez. But the same dynamic of twins, but then who is the firstborn of the twins? This is a recurring theme in these Genesis stories. Afterward, his brother came out with a crimson thread on his hand, and he was named Zerah. So we've got supposedly a firstborn by some calculations as reddish, connected with red, and then a secondborn being the chosen one, because Perez, we will find, will be coming through him we get to David, the king, and Solomon. And eventually, out of the house of David is supposed to come the Messiah. So, anyway, so this little story is seems like a diversion that doesn't have much to do with anything, but it is loaded with interesting subjects. And let me get back to where I need to start. Okay. I was, at the end last week, I was going to read a couple of selections in Dana Fuel's work and Rabbi Harold Jonathan Sachs, but I'm going to wait to the end because Bruce Vaughter's traditional commentary had a whole lot of things that were very interesting to lift up about this story. He suggests that by the nature of this interlude about Judah separating from his brothers, and he went up to reside among the Adulamites and married a Canaanite woman, this daughter of Shua, and had sons by her, that as far as historical accuracy, connecting some real-life human beings who lived back then, whose names became tribal names and so forth, that Judah was a latecomer into the Israelite federation and developed into the nation, that this Judah tribe was a latecomer. Now that may sound strange to make such a statement when we follow the storyline of Genesis, which makes in the storyline there was first coming down from Abraham and Sarah, these patriarchs, and then these sons, and then through the sons spread out and developed tribes as they grew. But historically, through scholarship and archaeology and comparative religions and linguistic studies and so forth, the historical reality was probably more like there were various tribal groups who found themselves together in a geographical region at a point in time in history that they were sharing very similar religious beliefs, and that was evolving into a monotheism that was different from all the paganism and polytheism around them, but not only a shared understanding of who God was, but they were also facing hostile forces outside of their region. Babylon, for example, and Assyria, and from Egypt, that they were right there in that crossroads, and there were all these hostile forces. So the stories of the patriarchs was developed to weave the histories of these individual tribes and give them a common identity that kind of made them one people instead of a diverse people, so to speak. One extended family is a unifying process to get them to hold it together against the hostiles. Because we've got these similarities, we need to not be fighting with each other, but work together. Because they did tend to fight with each other. We've got these different stories. At one time they're hostile, another time they're cooperating, and so forth. But but anyway, we have that happening at this point, and so the story that we're following in Genesis is trying to strengthen the bonds of loyalty and support, and also identifying who we are as a confederacy, who we are as one unified group over and against who we're not. Who are these others that aren't a part of us? And so the stories are a part of that delineation of who's us and who's not us. And as we see in our study of the histories of the last few hundred years of Western civilization, that alliances come together in different configurations and split apart, and sometimes they're closer and more cooperative, and then other times they're on opposite sides and fighting each other, and so forth. So, like we had France and England were fighting each other all the time, and then against Hitler and Germany, then they become allies, and so forth. So a little bit of that kind of moving in and out of alliances was a part of these early histories of these tribes. Anyway, Judah plays such a significant role in the longer story of Genesis in the Hebrew Bible, because, as I said, it is from Judah that we get King David and Solomon, and then the promise of the Messiah coming out of the house of David. And for us Christians, he already came. For the Jews, they're still waiting, but it's still that expectation out of the house of Judah. Well, Vaughter explains this and takes us to the Song of Deborah in Judges 5, which has its roots all the way back into 1200 before the Common Era, and several hundred years before the time of this writing. And the listing of the tribes of Israel that are going out to do battle in that poem in Judges 5 names Ephraim, which became Joseph's tribe, Ephraim, and then Benjamin, the two Rachel sons, and then Machir, that's not mentioned later, but that's a tribe that's listed in the Judges 5, and then later lists the sons of Jacob, or tribes of Israel, Zebulun, Issachar, Reuben, and then it lists Gilead, which is not in later list, and then Dan, Asher, and Naphtali. And so it comes out only 10 tribes. But in Genesis 35, when we get the complete list that we usually work off of, we've got Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Issachar, and Zebulun, 6 children of Leah, and then Rachel's 2 children, Joseph and Benjamin, and then Bilhah, Rachel's maid servant, Dan and Naphtali, and then Zilpah's Leah's maidservant, Gad and Asher, and then we get the 12 there. But from the 1200 B.C., Reuben, Zebulun, Asher, Dan, Naphtali, Joseph, Ephraim, Benjamin, Issachar, and Dan. But then it also added a Gilead and a Machir, which aren't mentioned later, as 2 tribes. And it omits from the early list, but it's in the later. The early one doesn't mention Judah, Gad, Levi, or Simeon. And the point is, the evidence that Judah came into the federation later. An early federation only had 10 and some different names, and then the later one had 12, and Judah is then in that list. But no effort is made in this story to hide or explain away the fact that Judah marries a Canaanite woman. A Judahite is also a Canaanite. So we've got a bonding of those two traditions. And at this point, from which this story arose, there wasn't a great problem with that. There was no great revulsion against intermarrying with the people in the land. Now we remember in the story of the rape of Dinah, it was such an outrage that there would be an intermarriage, that they go in and slaughter this whole Shechem family. Yes, sir? Well, it's a fluid kind of thing is what I'm saying. It was... Well, true. And that's why I'm saying, rather than, as we read the story, we're assuming it came down from Abraham and these families, and from the sons and the births that I read with Jacob's wives, that's where the tribes came from. And that story was told as a way of bringing unity and weaving all of these disparate tribes that found themselves together in a certain time of history to pull together the alliance and sew it up tight and strong through the story, taking each tribe's story and pieces of it and making it into one story as if these are all one family. But in reality, it was really a federation that came together. And so at a later, rather than originally, as your word said, it came out of an original situation that was a family. It didn't have, in historical study, it didn't have that origin. It was at a later time they had a federation, and then they kind of stamped it or baptized it as if it were a family. See the difference? Well, we'd have a very careful thing. You would have to go do the read the scholars in every place that Dan was mentioned, and the places there where they talked about where Dan's territory was, where they spread out and settled, and then from the comparative religion and looking at some of the cuneiform documents that they found that are outside the Bible that may have given evidence of... Right. And in fact, there was intermarriage and so forth. One of the commentaries said that the tribe of Simeon really got, with intermarriage and intermingling, really became gobbled up by the tribe of Judah. It didn't remain separate in the way of that history worked itself out. And then when we get to the exile, we have the tribes that disappeared because they did not keep and maintain their separate identity. There was too much intermarriage and intermingling, and they just lost their identity. But the ones that were in exile held strong, and they looked upon it as kind of becoming a purifying exercise. They kept their dietary customs and their worship customs far away in order to hang on to that tradition. And but others, like the ones who stayed in the land, the Samaritans, they seem to have kind of lost a lot of that. But anyway, there were something I hadn't realized. There were three, from the exile times, there were three groups of Jewish populations. Those that were carried off to Babylon in exile, and they stayed pretty close-knit and tight, and they had an understanding that, from Ezekiel and his idea of the chariot with the wheels, that God wasn't tied to their homeland, but that God could move with them, and that their God was with them in the exile. And that strengthened and purified their sense of identity and their worship. It developed the synagogue kind of worship that doesn't need the temple anymore. But they left the poor people in the area of Jerusalem, and they continued to worship at the destroyed temple. And one of the things that happened to them, a lot of the judgment of that the prophets said, it was because the upper classes, the wealthy, got wealthy because they stole the land of the poor. They enslaved their own people for debts and so forth, and took their land and virtually enslaved their lower class friends and neighbors. And that's why God judged them and allowed them to be conquered and carried away. Well, they carried away the upper class and the wealthy and the priests and educated so they could be literate and write their stories and keep their identity and worship, studying the stories. But the people left in the land kind of kept their beliefs, but a lot of those folks could retake the land that they had lost and have subsistence living and do better than they did before under their own leadership. They were able to do better under the Babylonian hegemony, and so they maintained a sense of identity, and they thought, even though it's destroyed, our God is still here, and we're worshiping, offering sacrifices at the destroyed temple, but nonetheless at the temple. And then there was others that fled and went down to Egypt. And they built a temple down there so they could have their sacrifices and continue to worship. So after the exile, when Cyrus said, okay, you guys can go home and rebuild your temple, well, those purified in the fire of the exile came back thinking that we're the only true children of Israel. Get back and find these ones down there and said, wait a minute. We're still children of Israel. We stayed here. God didn't go away. You did. And then the ones down in Egypt had a whole different kind of take on who they were, but they were still children of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So this, anyway, it isn't as tight and neat as we tend to think it is. Yeah. Yeah, they hadn't had that tight identity, but they still believed in God, and they still offered sacrifices and worshipped. And so anyway, that created conflict when they came back, because they just kind of assumed, well, we've still got the deed to this property in our heads. It's ours. You guys get off the land. And it's still like the Jewish immigrants who went back to Israel, and there happened to be Arabs, Palestinians who had for hundreds of years had lived there, and they said, well, this is our property. You guys lost it centuries ago. And then they said, oh no, it's ours. God gave it to us. You get off. And they still haven't resolved that. But it's some of the same dynamic. So anyway, part of that is why that's what seems to be a diversion story with Judah and Tamar is really pretty critical. But anyway, to get back to the point that we have in this story about Tamar, it raises lots of questions, and very quickly we have Judah marrying and having children that are growing up and getting married, and dies or is killed off by God because he did evil. And again, the evil is not named. But it really doesn't matter here. The real point is he died young. In order for there to be the need for this Levirate marriage that Onan would have to marry her. But it was, kind of a chicken and egg kind of thing, in that, in the Bible's perspective, the holiness code of much of the Old Testament is that if you're righteous and good, you live long and prosper. Spock, live long and prosper. If you're righteous and good. Now, if you die young, well, that just says you're not righteous and good. You did something evil, and it's God's judgment on you. So a short way of saying all of that is, died, God killed him because he was wicked. So, end of story. Now she's a widow. Now what happens? Well, Onan is supposed to go and perform the brother-in-law Levirate marriage rites, have children with her, so that the boys that would be produced would then carry name and heritage and keep his name alive. Now, as you may know, or maybe you don't know, at this time in history, the idea of the immortality of the soul, the eternal life in heaven, had not been developed. We remember Jacob is so distraught, he is going to go, and when he dies, he's going to go to Sheol and take his grief with him to the grave. It wasn't until after the Babylonian exile and some experience with Persia that within Judaism a concept of an immortality of the soul or spirit and life after death developed. But at this time, and still very much so, a strong influence in Judaism is that if you do not die and are gone and are nothing, if something of you is going to live on, is going to survive you, have some kind of life after death, some eternal life kind of element to it, it is that you will be remembered in the minds and in the tradition and in the heritage of the family. Your influence for good is passed on through your children, and your influence is recognized and remembered as the family tells the story of who begat who begat who begat who, and we are who we are, and we are proud because we have this heritage of this family passed on from generation to generation, and we honor the family name by being the people we are. That's the eternal life that they had, and why it was so important that the name not be lost if a man dies without children. So it is loyalty to the brother, and it is loyal to the family for the brother to go and have children with his brother's widow so that the brother's name can continue and not disappear from history. And so for Onan not to do that was the terrible sin that made him evil, and God killed him too. And so Judah at this time, he's thinking, this Tamar, she's the black widow. I'm not going to lose my third son. He's too young, Tamar. You go back and live in your father's house and wait till Shelah grows up, and then he can be your husband. Well, anyway, for us in the point of the story, Ur is dead and Tamar is a widow. The Levirate brother custom, Onan is supposed to do that. Let's see. Anyway, we've got the same custom in the Ruth and Boaz story that we'll talk about later, but it comes from this concept of Geulah, or redemption or vindication. Next of kin was to be the Goel, or Goel, which meant redeemer, saver, rescuer, or even avenger, as a blood vengeance, to track down and kill the murderer of your brother or cousin, as one aspect of this concept. And if one, and we have, Lot was kidnapped, and Abraham raises an army and goes off and rescues him as the next of kin to take care of him. In the current case, a brother dies childless. His brother takes the widow to produce a male child to carry on the family name. But before, as I said, this was before the immortality of the soul, so it was so important. Also, a critical issue in a society where family is so all-important. That who you are and your identity, your value, your worth, your significance is tied to this heritage of the family. And it has a religious emphasis as well, because this particular family is a chosen family, chosen by God to be a blessing, blessed to be a blessing to the whole world. And that is moving into this sense of identity. So it is a particularly strong Israelite concept and custom of this Geo of the family, the Levirate custom. And it's also tied to the understanding of God. God has this. God is the Redeemer. God is the Savior. God, and we read some of them that some of our more evangelical leaders in our tradition, like John Wesley, would say that some of those psalms are unfit for Christian lips to utter because they have this sense of vengeance. Will dash your children's heads against the rock. And but that's a part of this vengeance or avenging for the people. Anyway, but that is looked upon as a part of what God's character and loyalty to the people. And this is why Onan's sin is so terrible. He is selfish and unwilling to perform the duty, and it's a lack of loyalty to his brother and to his family and to the common faith of the people. And that is what angers God. It isn't that this spilling the semen upon the ground is really meant to be coitus interruptus and not masturbation, but some have taken it and twisted it and turned it into a condemnation that God killed him for masturbating. But that wasn't. We read the story. That's not what's there. So the sin or wickedness is the selfishness and dishonoring the loyalty to family. But anyway, after Onan dies, Judah seems to think that Tamar is dangerous, and he doesn't send Shelah on to be his brother's redeemer after Shelah matures. And Judah has not fulfilled the promise to give Tamar to Shelah in this Levirate marriage to produce sons for and then for Onan. And then coincidentally, Judah's wife, Shua's daughter, has died. That Canaanite woman who remains nameless. So then Judah is a widower, but he's done his prescribed period of mourning. And at this point, and within the Judahite tribe, it seems like monogamy seems to be the rule, because he doesn't have a concubine or maidservant of his wife that he can go into. He has no other wife. And so, as the story kind of seems to be playing out for us, he becomes easy prey, if you will, for Tamar to seduce him. But we also have another evidence of monogamy, is that Onan's reluctance to have children with Tamar, if she is his only wife, then he doesn't want his only child or children then to have to be dedicated to his brothers or his brother, and then for Shelah, his two brothers, to have offspring. But if they had multiple wives, that wouldn't matter. They could perform the Levirate duty and then produce children, but also have their own wife to produce their own children in their own name. So it seems like there's a monogamy value in this Judahite clan that wasn't before and didn't seem to be so strong in the other clans, which makes this all the more interesting here. But it's one of those cases, if we're just whipping right through and going on to get to Joseph down to Egypt, we wouldn't be noticing these little evidences of conditions at this time in that particular tribe. All right, then the text does not say if Shelah had actually gone ahead and married someone else, is why they hadn't been brought together, other than just the fear that he was going to die too. But if that was the case, then that would be another reason for not giving him, because if he had married someone else and they didn't have polygamy, then it's too late. He can't marry Tamar and take her as wife. But whatever the case is, in that regard, Tamar realized that she had to take matters into her own hands. She had heard that Judah was going up to the festival of the harvest celebration and the shearing of the sheep. And the text says that she put off her widow's garments and dressed differently. It doesn't say in her intention was to dress like a harlot and to look like a harlot. It just says she took off her widow's garb and put on a veil and then wrapped herself in a shawl. But it only says she did not have on the widow clothing, and that she did cover her face with a veil and the shawl, and sat down in a public place at the entrance of Enim. Now, that could be the sitting down in a particular place may have been like walking the streets in the red light district. In our old-fashioned jargon, you dress a certain way and you parade around and you hang out in certain places, carries a cultural message that you're advertising, which soliciting business, which sometimes gets used in rape cases of blaming the victim, she asked for it, kind of language. But the commentaries do not state that this was obviously the case. The text indicates, but it suggests a little bit of immodesty being out in public instead of in the home someplace. But it doesn't, and the commentators don't come out real strong with that. What the text does say is that when Judah saw her, he mistook her for the harlot. And the emphasis is upon his mistaking what he saw. And we have little expressions. Beauty is in the eye of the beholder. And if you take the inverse of that, ugliness is in the eye of the beholder. And I guess we could take it even farther. Sexy is in the eye of the beholder. But since she covered her face, he did not recognize who she was. And of course, he had not seen her much since he had sent her off to her father's house, out of his camp and out of his house, and it seems like it's been a few years since Sheila was young and has already grown up now. But believing her a prostitute, he asks her for her services, and she drives a bargain. They settled the deal. He has intercourse with her, and we learn later that she conceives twins. And someone asked about twins. Twins tend to be looked upon as a blessing. It's unusual, and particularly if it's twin boys, and even more so if they survive, and if the mother survives, because twins and triplets are very, very, it's very dangerous for the survival of the babies and the mother. But anyway, Judah goes away. It's interesting that when Judah sends his friend the Adulamite with the kid to make payment and retrieve the pledged items, he can't find her because she's changed clothes and put back on her widow's garb. But instead of asking where is the harlot or where is the prostitute who was working this corner, no one else had thought that she looked like the harlot. For they all said that there never was a harlot or a temple prostitute or anybody working there. So in that part of the story, in others' eyes, they didn't see a harlot or a prostitute. They may have seen Tamar, but they didn't see her that way. And also there's a shift. Instead of a secular, disrespected prostitute, now they're saying it was a temple prostitute, which has a whole different acceptance level in the Baal worship and fertility cults. Anyway, and that takes us back to Judah mistaking Tamar for the prostitute. It's back to sexy is in the eyes of the beholder. Bruce Vaughter suggests that Judah had completed his formal mourning, and he goes with his friend on an out-of-town convention. It's party time and gets a little liquored up and wants some fun. And what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas is, what's going on here. Well, Vaughter explains that the significance of the pledge, the seal and the cord and the staff. Now, the seal was if you had a written document, you put this wet clay on it to seal it, and you put your seal on it to identify you. It's like a formal signature or those stamps and so forth. And the cord, you held it around your neck because that was your personal signature and contract signer or document that identified exactly who you were. It was unique and different. And then the staff also, they would all be different. And if you were wealthy of any means, you might have jewels in it. It was yours. And it was kind of like Judah had given her his driver's license or his Social Security card. It was his identity, who he was. Well, yeah. It could be that, or he could just be still liquored up and not using good judgment. But anyway, passions make us irrational. I think I mentioned that once before. Our sex is not rational. It's irrational. But anyway, when she becomes publicly pregnant, it's interesting that it's not her father or her family that wants to kick her out. It's Judah that he seems to see it as a big sin. And actually it is. It's kind of like Mary and Joseph. They were betrothed, and she was with child before they came together. That in this situation, she was essentially betrothed to Sheila. And for her to become pregnant before they came together was judged an act of adultery. And so the punishment was supposed to be stoning, but he wants to burn her immediately. So there's a little extreme reaction. It's kind of, I want to get rid of her quickly. She's an embarrassment, a nuisance. I feel guilty because of neglecting my obligations. Now I'm off the hook. A whole bunch of things going on there that we could spend a lot of time talking about. But she produces the identity of the father of the baby or babies she's carrying. And interestingly, the point is made, she did not embarrass him to public shame. She is still a good person. She is respectful. But she just gave him the evidence and said, you identify these things, without saying to the rest of the world, pointing the finger at him, saying he's the one, let him decide, and then he took the appropriate steps to take her in. Now, since nobody would know what all of that meant, now he could still save face, and he could be very magnanimous and forgiving and gracious and take care of her, his son's widow, rather than being hateful and vengeful and having her put to death. And then again we have the repeating of the theme of twins, viewed as God's blessing, and then this firstborn, secondborn, who is God's chosen, and then we have this sense of this is a part of God's plan, because Perez is going to be an ancestor of King David. And all the listeners to the story are going to know that and recognize that, and that is pretty much the point that these these writers of the Bible are trying to share with their audience and then share it with us. But the part I'm going to pick up later or next time and deal with the feminists' look at this and how out of all these names and all the importance of sons that the women, and then this is so